is that the sessions are recorded. And so as all the sessions are recorded, everybody who registers will be sent the recordings every week. And this is also similar to our other Chicano psychology classes, where you have, if you'd like, we offer session completion certificates and then course completion certificates. So what we do is after the class, later on today or tomorrow, you'll be sent the recording link as well as a really straightforward, simple feedback form. And you just, if you want the certificates, you respond to the feedback form. That's counted as your attendance. But that's optional. Those that respond to all 6 feedback forms will then be given a course completion certificate. Right? So so those are just things that we offer. A lot of people have really appreciated that because it's important to them, which I understand, and others just kind of come and they just want to be part of it, and it's not really something that they necessarily want. So we like to kind of just at least offer that for everybody. So my name is Manuel Samaripa. I am the co-founder and co-director of the Institute of Chicano-Chicanic Psychology and Community Wellness, along with my dualidad, Tlasotiani Jessica, who will probably be in some of these sessions as well in the next few weeks. And part of what we do in the Institute is offer these classes because we really feel that not enough of us know about Chicanic psychology. And I know that was my experience as well. So I have been a student and a teacher of Chicano psychology for over 30 years. And we have other courses as well that talk a little bit more about that history. And so what I want to do is I want to invite people to just open in a good way. What we do in the Institute, for those of you that may or may not know, just to remind everybody, is we take a culturally responsive psychology, and at the same time, we also honor our cultural and ancestral ways of healing and knowledge. And so we do both. And so one of the things that's really important is that we open in a good way. We open in a good way. We see ourselves every time we meet as a circle. The circle is sacred in our traditions and in many people's traditions. And so the way we've looked at it when we do the virtual offerings is that we're a virtual circle. And so in the tradition of our people, probably like a lot of others, when we meet in Círculo, usually we would meet outside, but this is our inside and outside. We ask for an opening palabra, which, doesn't necessarily mean one word if you translate it in Spanish. It just means like your opening intention, something you just want to say. And it could be what you're hoping for the class. It could be kind of just where you're at. It could just be an intention, right? And it's an invitation. You can also share your intention in the chat if you'd like, or you can just, you can decline. Nothing here is required. We've already had enough of that, things imposed on us as a people. So everything's an invitation. So all that being said, if we were in Círculo, we don't do the which is fine, but and kind of cool and fun, but we don't do like the popcorn, people choose each other. In our ancestral ways, there's always a rhyme and a reason and intention for every movement we make. And so we would start with the person to our left always, because that's the direction of the heart. And so when we do this virtual Círculo, I always look to the person to my left on my screen. And then so when that person gives an intention, then I will call the next person that I see on the left so that we can make a virtual circle. I hope that's okay. So the first person I see is Mayra. Hello, Mayra. It's good to see you. Would you like to share an opening palabra?
Yeah, my name is Mayra Hernandez. I'm a licensed MFT in California, and my intentions is to continue learning from everybody. I usually can only make it to the first one, which I try, and the rest I do after the recordings are sent. But I appreciate being here, and I've learned so much from you, Dr. Samaripa. Like, I've been recommending this course and all the courses that I've attended with you, with a lot of my colleagues. So yeah, it's been wonderful for you to put out this resource for all of us. So thank you. Yeah.
Mateo, thank you. Tulso Kamati. Erica, I invite you to share an opening palabra if you'd like.
Yes, hi, thank you. And I'm excited to be here. I would say my opening palabra would be just my intention, which is to receive, to learn. I'm excited for this course.
Mateo, thank you so much. My Blanchard.
Hi, I'm Mai. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist out in Salt Lake City, Utah. And my intention is to learn. I specialize in second gen immigrant trauma, and there's not a lot of clinicians of color out here, so I have a really large caseload of Latinx, and even though there is a lot of similarities in Vietnamese culture and like Latinx culture, I don't want to be presumptuous, and I want to learn to better help them.
Thank you so much, Mai. Gracias. Thank you. Catalina, would you like to share opening palabra?
Sure. I'm a returning student. I took the Chicana identity course in the previous series, and I have been a researcher in academia for quite a while. I'm currently in a career transition out of academia, but I was trained and my interests were in psychology, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology. And my experiences, as our professor had said, was that, there was just glaring holes of not representation of Chicano, Mexican American experiences in those courses. It was all from a colonialized perspective, European white perspective. There's many reasons that I didn't feel like I fit as both a student and a researcher in those environments. And so I found out about these courses through language revitalization, a language collected for Nawa. And I really enjoyed the previous course. So I'm back for this one. And because I'm interested in developmental, I'm really interested to hear about Chicanx development in families.
Gracias. Thank you. Tulso Kamati, Catalina. Christy, do you have an intention that you'd like to share? An opening palabra.
Yali, thank you. My name is Christy. I'm presencing from the Maydew, the Nisenan lands in Sacramento. I have been following along the courses this year, and it's been really enriching for me in my journey. I was referred to this program through Leslie from Latinx Parenting. So my intentionality has been, since I've become a parent, and I have now a almost 4-year-old, my intentionality has been to decolonize my parenting. And it's also a very lonely path because I'm the only one doing it in my familia. Yeah. And so for me, it's been a real blessing to just see other faces that look like me and that feel the things I feel. It's really just like such like uplifting and like moral support. I'm experiencing estrangement from 3 of my older siblings. It's been incredibly painful. So I feel the extended kinship in this course. So thank you so much.
Mateo, Tulso Kamati, thank you, Christy. Jose, how are you, Jose?
Hey, thank you. Gracias a todos. Appreciate it. It's nice. Thank you for allowing me into the room. My name is Jose Salcedo. I work out of Oregon for a nonprofit called Latino Network. I work as a youth mentor for youth impacted by gun violence and also youth impacted by the juvenile justice system. And so one of the big hopes is in, being a part of this group is just to bring some of that knowledge so I could help my youth evolve and, change their habits. I'm also going for my bachelor's in psychology. and I'm double majoring in ethnic studies, which is Chicano, Chicano studies, but in their language, it's ethnic studies.
Yeah.
So a lot of this ties around what I do.
Excellent, man. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm sorry, did you have more? I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
No, I just wanted to say gracias.
Oh,
Thank
Mateo. Thank you, gracias. We were just out in Oregon a couple of weeks ago, south of Portland by Silver Falls State Park, Silverton. There
Yeah,
was
no, I heard about that. You guys were really close. Silverton is not too far from us. It's like probably like maybe an hour, less than an hour away. And I wasn't aware that you guys were in town until I looked on the website or until I looked on your guys' post. And I was like, oh, that would have been nice to attend.
Yeah, I'm so sorry we missed you, but we made some good connections there, and most likely we'll return at some point, probably next year, sometime soon. So we hope to keep that connection. And the next time we'll make sure to let people know ahead. We were surprised. We got a couple of messages when we were there, when we were posting. They were like, "Oh, you're so close. We didn't know you were here." So that we were surprised by that. So next time we'll make sure and we let people know that we're coming out there. Well, thank you all so much for sharing. And I just want to share, my palabra of gratitude for each of you being here for what the work that you're doing in your life, for who you are. And I just really am appreciative of this time we're going to spend together. I think Christy, do you know about Latinx estrangement also on Instagram?
Yeah, I know she's been in these courses alongside me, so
Yes, she has. Yes. Okay. Okay. Good. Well, let me go ahead and share. So we can begin sharing some of what we have. Let's see. Okay. Here we go. I don't know if some of you, I just wanted to point out that I think the listing of the titles of each class kind of got flipped a little bit. The first session we're going to do is Familismo, for those of you that saw it, and the second session was then we're going to go back and look at the history of the development of Chicanx familias, family. So, but we did want to start with the idea of familismo because that's something that we hear about a lot, and it's also important to say that well, we're going to talk through kind of the different ways to look at familismo, but I think it's safe to say that that has been something that has been a core piece of us understanding ourselves, I think, in a lot of ways, and so I think it's a good place to start. I also want to say to everybody again that this is not necessarily like a typical class in the sense that if you ever have any questions or thoughts or comments, please, you can join in at any time. You can raise your hand, you can unmute, because it's really, it's really about us coming together. So let's see. Okay. So this idea of familismo, we hear about it growing up a little bit, or some of us hear about this word, some of us don't, but we know the idea that the familia is a core piece of our culture, who we are. And it's similar in a lot of ways to a lot of collectivistic cultures. That's one of the main things that we're going to talk a little bit about that. And some of you have been in some other offerings. And one of the main things that we always talk about in trying to kind of show how it is that we seem to maybe identify or do things differently is the idea that our cultura is a collectivistic culture, and the culture of mostly European countries and now the United States is more of an individualistic culture. And so that is what really leads to a lot of the the, the conflicts and a lot of the differences. Um, and so I think that's an important place to kind of start with, and we'll talk more about it today as we go through it. But when you have kind of more of a formal, not necessarily formalized, but like long-standing traditions of, the sense of familismo, some things tend to be noticed, even though they can be different in different families. And some points here, some families have them more than other families. There's always variation all the time. We're not robots, right? But at the same time, we can still see threads, like commonalities, right? And so one of the things that we see is that there tends to be what we call prescribed duties, which means like certain people in the family tend to grow up with an expectation of attending to certain duties within the family, right? Loyalty being a big one, and so I think that's one thing that we can really look at again is how we see loyalty, because a lot of the times it's seen kind of just like in a two-dimensional way, like you either have it or you don't. But it's really on a continuum, and it really is kind of more of the intention that we're going to look at. Because a lot of the times, the intention that our families have for certain things, we only know how to look for that intention by looking at certain behaviors. And I think that's also some things that make it difficult, because if we can look at other behaviors that also have that same intention, then we can start to see the different ways in which like we could show that we're loyal. We also know, of course, that for us, like a lot of collectivistic cultures, when we say family, we also mean extended family. And as I'm saying that, I'm smiling because the ideas and the concepts of the nuclear family and extended family are individualistic concepts, right? That's why the individualism has to distinguish between the nuclear and the extended family. But for collectivistic cultures, a lot of the times, when you say family, that's who you include, right? It would be there is no extended family, right? That concept wouldn't make sense. It also means too that when we think of family, sometimes we don't necessarily think of blood relations, right? We think of extended relationships, kinships. And so this is some of the key pieces of families. Well, now, there are some cultures and some families, some individualistic cultures and families, some white families that can also share a lot of these notions, right? And there's also a lot of families within our own cultura that are seemingly more individualistic. That doesn't negate, it doesn't deny that these differences are still real, right? I mean, because there's the cultural lens and cultural traditions that have passed down, which are broader. And then there's individual experiences. So certain families will have certain experiences that will make them look a little different than other families, even from the same culture. And I say that because sometimes, people will say, well, wait a minute, like I'm come from this family and I think that way too. And that makes sense, because there are always exceptions, there's always variation, but that variation doesn't mean that this also is not true, right? It's also true that for the majority of our familias, there's a lot of thread of familismo, right? And it's also true that for the majority of individualistic families, that's not necessarily true. So so we understand that there's differences here and there, but those individual, exceptions, or those minor exceptions, don't change, right, the major patterns that we've seen over the years. So I hope that makes sense. Um, Sometimes in our familias, one of the things that we talk about when we talk about values is it's really what some people have called idealized values, right? Which is we talk about our families or our values as they should be, right? We should act this way as a father, or we should act this way as a daughter. Right? Um, and so a lot of the times, um, these values don't always necessarily reflect how we actually act, right? What we actually do. Even those of us that are espousing those values, right? I could say a father should be a certain way, and that could be my value. I believe that a father should act a certain way, a father should be a certain way. But as a father, that doesn't necessarily mean that even if I have those values, that I always act in those ways, right? Um, and so that's important. That doesn't necessarily mean that the person doesn't really believe in those values, because that's a very like just too simple to say, well, if that's what you believe in, that's how you should act. One, that's really not the way human development works, right? You know, it kind of makes sense. It's kind of normal actually to have idealized values, because those idealized values are the values that we want to move toward, right? That's how we want to be. And if we come up short sometimes, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a failure. It may mean a lot of things. It could mean sometimes, you know, if there's other behaviors going on, but it just means that it's understandable that in our families, we have idealized values of how we should be. And at the same time, we should recognize that that doesn't mean we're always going to act in that value in that way. Um, it doesn't mean that we contradict like completely, like we act a completely different way. It just means that we don't live up to these idealized values. And that just means, you know, things happen, we're still learning, or we're trying to move through, you know, certain things in our lives. And we need to keep that kind of continuum in mind, right? Um, and I say that too because a lot of the times, I think part of the internalized oppression, which we'll talk more about, that has been given to our families, that we've internalized, that we've put on ourselves, is that like, hey, this is how we are as Latinos, as Chicanos, you know, this is how we should be, and we don't always act up to that, and then we either internally are hard on ourselves or extra hard on our families. Um, and so that's something I think we could probably recognize, a lot of us, and it's an important place to know like that we should recognize that there are certain things we're moving toward, but that doesn't necessarily mean that if we're not there, that we need to be overly punished. There's a difference between guidance and motivation and oppression, right? Big differences, right? One of the more traditional, of course, we've seen this with idealized values, is the idea of virginity before marriage for women, right? But it's never been necessarily for men, right? That's an idealized one. I'll talk more about that. Ideal values, the way we act, are respect for elders, solidarity, cooperation, collectivism, right? But as we've noticed, as acculturation happens, modernizations happen, then our actual individual behaviors move farther away from these idealized values. Okay, so one of the things I think is important to note is that times change, situations change, economic situations shift for families as they try to survive, as they move forward, as we become acculturated more to this kind of the US culture way of being. And that happens a lot quicker than cultural change. Cultures do shift, values do change, But by the definition of kind of, the way cultural values form, is it takes generations and generations for cultural values to form, and it also takes time for cultural values to shift. So that's sometimes we see that discrepancy, like individual families, their behaviors can change and may not live up to those idealized values. And those idealized values may come from, a lot of times, some of them can come from a time and a space that they developed over generations that don't necessarily apply to where we're at now. I say that because we have to understand the way culture is so that we can be fair about things that, that we know are changing. And at the same time, we also, I believe we need to just be cautious of being too internally critical. Like, man, like, okay, idealized values of virginity before marriage. That can be very oppressive, as a lot of you know, right? For women and families, for daughters. And that, of course, came from the ideal that, well, what does that mean? Well, that virginity before marriage is supposed to mean that you are in alignment with, a lot of times, certain religious values. It means that supposed to mean that you are respectable. It's supposed to mean all these things. And it's really never meant that, even, all through the years, because it's an idealized value, right? And so what we know is that all of those things it's supposed to mean doesn't necessarily mean any of those things. But it's the intention behind the value. Like, the intention is, this is what's been passed down. This is our barometer of what we're supposed to look to say, like, I have raised a good daughter, right? Or this daughter is a good person in the family. And there's a lot of holes in that, but that's kind of the intention behind that. Now, when you have a lot of our familias that move, for example, to the United States, if you're first or second generation, and they're in a society that might be very different, or at least seemingly very different, then what we can see a lot of the times is we can see more of a regression, like holding on to these idealized values even more than if the familia stayed in their country of origin, right? Because all of a sudden the families are faced with things that seem so much different that they pull back and they kind of hold on to some of these values even more. So it's really all this process of acculturating that makes it really tricky for particularly first and second generation familias. So I feel like I've said a lot, and I want to just kind of like pause really quick and check in with everybody. Any questions or thoughts? Anything you want to put in the chat before we move on? Okay. Well, please know you can do that at any time. I don't know how good my microphone is, but it's thundering out here. I don't know if y'all can hear that. Okay. Let's see. I didn't mean for it to go all the way off again. All right. Okay. All right. I'm still. There we go. Okay. So one of the things, of course, that we've seen a lot in our and our families is interdependence, what they call interdependence or interpersonal accountability, which is kind of that expectation that that the family and the larger system, that in other words, the expectation that you're going to have their back. I got your back, you got my back, right? And so that's that accountability. If I don't have to say it explicitly, but if something were to happen where you weren't supportive, then you're going to be held accountable. Like, why didn't you support your brother? Why didn't you support your sister? What's going on? And so this idea of interpersonal accountability is seen as kind of an outlet of protecting the family or protecting the family name. That has been part of a lot of our cultura in a lot of the countries that are now called Latin American countries. But they're particularly important for Chicanx families because not only now do we have this family value, but then again we have it in this country where, you know, for generations and generations, there are still struggles, right, with our communities, with our people in this country, with marginalization, prejudice, discrimination. And so this idea of protection of the family name, you could argue, you know, is more elevated with Mexican American families, with Chicanx families in particular, because there's that added layer of experiences of marginalization, right? And negative stereotypes, right? Which we know a lot about. So the degree to which each family adheres to all of these values, again, depends on the degree of acculturation the family is experiencing, right? If you're very acculturated to the larger US society, then these conflicts are a little bit less than if you're not very acculturated at all, right? But there's always that continuum. There's always that continuum. It's hardly ever yes or no, right? A lot of the times we're able to see the polar opposites, like we can detect them because they're so different, but a lot of us are kind of somewhere in that middle ground. So that's why we see that we have different cultural influences, right? A hybrid of cultural influences. We still have familismo or familism in English, personalismo, cariño, simpatía, right? Respect. These are still a lot of cultural ideas that we have, right? Even though we may vary on a lot of these are still tend to be part of who we are. And some of the studies that are out there, you know, from Chicano psychology's field has shown us that one of the things that persist into the fourth, fifth, sixth generation of Mexican American families are some of these familismo ideals or cultural values, right? So in other words, we may not speak Spanish as much. We may lose that. That's one of the first markers, as everybody knows, that really drops off from one generation to the next. But and we may not actually do specific rituals that maybe our families did, you know, generations back in Mexico or other countries, right? Maybe we don't do specific rituals that were done before. So on the face again, and it is kind of a sign of acculturation, but the familismo values tend to persist, right? They tend to be influenced by, you know, kind of mixed and they look different, but the core values tend to persist. throughout the generations. And so what we found also is that developmentally, psychologically, that having those values, of course, in a healthy way, because we can talk, anything can become any type of cultural value, no matter what culture it comes from, even US white culture, can be unhealthy or healthy, right? Anything can be unhealthy or healthy. But when we're talking about some of the cultural values that we have in a healthy way, that they tend to be protective factors, which means they help us psychologically and developmentally to not let the stressors of everyday life affect us as much, right? They help protect us against that. So, so they have a lot of positive attributes to them. And that's an important thing to, I think, carry with us. So I'm going to have you all talk to each other in small groups for a little while. And I'm not going to be able to send this to you, unfortunately. So maybe you want to take a screenshot or something. But what I can do is the questions below, I can put them in the chat in a second. But really, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think of maybe two major decisions you've made in your life. Two major decisions about your life that you made. I mean, it could be like to get married, not to get married. It could be to leave home for school. It could be to move out on your own before your parents were ready. It could be something about your career, something about your family. But two major decisions in your life. And on a scale, right, on this kind of continuum, kind of like how involved was your family in that decision, right? And the polar opposites is they weren't involved or they were equally involved. But remember, it's just kind of like for a lot of people, some of us are on those polar opposites, but for a lot of us, it's like, well, they were mostly not involved, but they kind of were. And so just gauge for yourself, right? And some questions to help you, might be like, well, who helped you make the decisions? Were they helpful? And why were these people or this person involved in your decision, right? So I'm going to put you all in breakout rooms for that, okay? So let's see, where are we here? First, let me stop and let me make this. Let me copy the questions because that might be helpful for you. Okay. Okay, I'm going to put that in the chat. Okay, there you go. All right. Okay, now I'm gonna, let's see, I'm gonna put you on to some breakout rooms. And we'll do this for about, 5 minutes or so. That seems okay. So if you've done breakout rooms before, you know what to do. If you haven't, something should pop up on your screen. Just accept or enter or whatever it says. And go ahead and go into your breakout room, and we'll be back in about 5 minutes or so. Okay, good to see everybody back together again. As some of you know, every time we come back from one of these like breakout groups and discussions, I always like to check in with everyone and invite anyone to share anything they'd like to. Of course, you don't have to share anything. And one of the things I like to do is give the option to, if you don't feel comfortable maybe sharing what you said, or you don't want to, or just, you want to keep that private, then I invite you to maybe share what it was like to have the conversation. Like, you don't have to share what you said, but maybe you can share like, well, this was interesting, this was difficult, or I thought the questions were interesting, or I've done something like this before. I just like to give people options. So, so I'm going to hand it over. You're welcome to share whatever you'd like to share. Maybe you do want to share what you said. or maybe you just want to kind of share what the process was like. But I'd like to put it out and see and check in with you. Go ahead.
I can share. I think it was interesting that it was three of us in a group, and we kind of, I think we're thinking similarly when we thought of examples in our lives that really where family played such a big role. And I'll just share mine, right? Just like my going away to college experience, which didn't happen because my family was like, you are not leaving this state and you're definitely not leaving this house. I did go to college. I just had to commute. So I think that's one thing we were talking about, right? And the ladies in the group had similar but different experiences, right? And then the other piece is just thinking about how when we celebrate anything, right? A wedding, a party, baptism, like I'm just thinking, so many thoughts are coming to my mind. I'm probably, out of my mom is one of 11, so I have tons of cousins, right? And I'm the oldest. I'm on the older side of the generation, and I'm very much still like, either you invite everybody, even the ones you don't really like, or you invite no one, right? Because that's just the way it is. Where my younger cousins who are, in their 20s are like, no, that's not my boundary is I don't want people that, can be offensive or that don't know how to act. And just watching that happen and thinking about generationally where we're at too, being in different places. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Rachel. I appreciate it. Thank you. Anyone else like to invite anyone else that may want to share anything?
Yeah, I'll piggyback on we were in the same group, and I shared that when I was 18, I making the decision to go to college, and even though it was met with support, it was like half and half because my parents wanted me to stay behind. I'm in Fresno now, but I went to Cal State Fresno, but we had Cal State Bakersfield that was 30 minutes away. And my mom wanted me to stay home. Like, why are you gonna leave? Like, why are you leaving? Like, you're here. But for me, like, just the situation at home, like my dad was an alcoholic and all that stuff that was happening with my parents, I said that it's gonna suck me in, like, and it's gonna affect me. And I knew I wanted to be someone. I know I wanted to go to college and do these things. So I said, I have to go. And so, bien o mal, like, I me trajeron, but it was still met with like resentment, I think, at the beginning for leaving 2 hours away, but and it's something that decision still kind of, sometimes my mom will bring it up, ¿verdad? Like, pues tú quisiste irte, te fuiste,
Yeah.
nos tenías acá, like it's like that, pero estoy orgullosa de ti, like, all the stuff you're accomplished, but it's kind of like, so it's interesting, but it's just part of my family stuff. So yeah,
Yeah.
but thank you.
Thank you, Mayra. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's interesting how this comes out in different ways. I've shared, I think, before. I'm not sure where and when. But yeah, my going away to college was interesting because I thought one thing about my mom, and it turned out to be something else. And so what it was my mom. Growing up, my mom had always said, "Go away, go to college, go away." Like, Texas schools are terrible. I don't know why she would ask, go out of the state, go. So I would think, I was like, wow, my mom kind of with it. She's very different than the other, Mexican moms, Chicana moms I know. I was like, okay. So I always had that, and I did. I went out of state, right? And then, then after that, of course, went to graduate school out of state, out of state. I would come back to visit, and it wasn't until like after I was done, like years after I was done, that I would hear things from my sister and other things that, like, well, one, I came back different. College changed me. I came back different. But I guess my mom wasn't the person to say that to my, to say it. Like she never treated. She was always like, and two, she did want me to go away, but I lived outside of. I'm closer. I'm from San Antonio. Everyone's in San Antonio, Texas, and I'm in Austin, so closer and everything. But I wasn't for a long time, for years and years. And there was this unspoken expectation that she never said clearly. She thought I was going to go and come back. So she had it kind of, so she kind of was in this interesting like continuum where she did have those values. But for some reason, this one thing like this value of education, right, in her mind was like, go do this, but she never said that. And so there was all of these things that I heard from my other family about how she had expected me to come back and she was upset that I wasn't back. So so sometimes we don't realize where that acculturation is, or some of those values persist but they show up in different ways, or we don't know where they're at because of, well, for like my mom, she didn't communicate it directly, right? So anyway, y'all sharing that reminded me of that. So thank you for letting me share that. I'm going to go ahead and even if I put this back on again, if you have something to say, please do so. I put the PowerPoint back up. Okay. So for a lot of our families, what we've seen, what we've known, what we've seen, and what some other Chicanic psychologists have found, a lot of the times the research, one of the important things about doing research, people say, of course, is that we can't always just go based on like what we feel we know, right? Because something else might be going on, so we have to research the problem, or research whatever the issue. But it's also funny when it's because it's important to do the research in the field, but when the research turns up what we already knew, right? And so that's good when that happens too, right? It's good when that happens as well. So the basic social unit, I think, for us is the extended family. That's kind of like how we understand ourselves in the smallest social structure is the extended family a lot of the times, which is different from individualist families, that it's the nuclear family, right? But the way the family looks, how it's structured, of course, depends on a lot of things for every family. But for our family, a lot of things it depends on, a lot of times in our history has to do with some of our families were migrant workers. My father's family was. My father was the 12th child out of 12, so he was on the younger side. So when we grew up, we didn't have that experience, but a lot of my uncles and aunts, the older ones, did. They traveled to Michigan. They followed the crops from Michigan to Texas. And so, and of course, blue collar, white collar, kind of economic structure affects the way the families look, right? And affects kind of, are we going to keep this extended family structure that we had before migration to the United States? That depends, right? If a lot of our families continue to be blue collar or labor, physical labor for economic survival, a lot of the times, a lot of that structure stays similar. But if that changes, then the structure of the family begins to change, right? And so the more typical way, of course, that we know is more of a vertical structure, right? Where parents and elders have the most authority. Um, I think we're going to talk more about this next time, but there's two ways, at least two ways of looking at hierarchy. The hierarchy and the vertical organization of the authority of the parents and the elders that comes mostly from a European perspective is where we see a lot more of the oppression of that hierarchical structure, right? They hold the most authority and it can become oppressive. But from our indigenous family structure, there is a respect for parents and elders. They do hold that type of authority, but they usually do in more of a reciprocal sense that they have more of the wisdom and they tend to guide. And so the family and the societal structure definitely holds the elders and the parents with more authority, but that authority wasn't and isn't used in the same oppressive way, like to control as it was with more of the European Spanish way. And it's used more as to guide and to offer wisdom. And also it's that reciprocal, more of a reciprocal, like we will be the elders one day, like, and so we give to the elders now so that cycle of life, right? The circle of life really is something that was honored in a lot of indigenous systems, right? So because primarily the main intention of that hierarchical structure that we see now um, kind of comes from more the Spanish or the European way of doing things, because that was the invasion, right? That was um, that's where we see today in our contemporary families when it becomes more oppressive. It's because it comes from that vertical um, the vertical way that that tends to be more about control. Um, and so, but what we are seeing though, as we see times change, as we see families shifting, because our families are shifting not only because of the acculturation in the United States, but as we've heard, like globally, economies are changing, right? The way countries operate are changing, and so again, it's not just acculturation to the U.S. We've seen shifts in family structures in other ways in a lot of other countries. And so here's where you see kind of, when there's always that joke when we see our parents treat our kids, we say, or the grandkids, a lot easier. You're like, that is not the person that raised me, right? That is not how they were. They were completely strict. And so grandparents, in the very simple explanation, tend to want to spoil their grandkids more. They want to make it easier. Not always, not always we see some, but in general. But what we see too is that's kind of what rises to the surface, and that's genuine. But the reason why some grandparents, without them knowing it or not, allow themselves that is not only is it just about like being easier with their grandkids, but it's also that at that point in life, they have lived through a lot of decisions and they are relinquishing some of those ways of living that they felt they needed to live under. And so sometimes you see the grandparents kind of sticking up for the grandkids when they want to do something that's a little different than the parents want. The parents want to be more strict. And so we see that, right? But we do also see in other ways this idea of having respect for authority that we see needs to happen within and outside the family, right? But as families begin to shift, you start to see kind of a little more of that flexibility in the home with specific family issues. And kids can be really good about making things very specific. And so sometimes we begin to see some of those shifts within the family. But one of those values of respect and kind of the family name, like, okay, maybe we'll shift a little bit within the family, but there's still that expectation to act a certain way outside the family, right? To make sure you carry on that respect, you carry on that way of treating others outside the family. And so we see some things that are kind of shifting. And so we're starting to see more differences in family structures, right? We still have the extended family, but sometimes even the extended family looks different. We see a lot more, of course, for many, many years, single parent families, nuclear families, alternative families, which may mean not necessarily blood families, but chosen families. And so we're in a very interesting contemporary shift. How that shift is going to play out, I would give it at least 50 more years to see kind of if we're gonna, what it's really gonna look like. But we're in a shift where our family structures are both and. Many families look still very traditional, quote unquote traditional, and many of our families look very different. For many of our families, we have that both within the family. So we have super extended family orientation, way of being, and within our extended family, there's a lot more single parent families, right? Or there's a lot more people that are included in the extended family that aren't blood relatives. And so we're starting to see a lot of overlapping structures that still falls under this idea of familismo, right? And so regardless, it's this notion of interdependence, right? It's this concept of connectedness, no matter how the family structure looks, right? What binds us is this sense of interdependence, right? Not codependence, as they say in the field, or dependence, but interdependence. The idea that being dependent on someone else and then be dependent on you is a good thing. So there's a lot of fancy names for that, interdependence, right? But if you look indigenously, of course, there's always been that notion of interdependence, as we know. There's always been that notion of what we call energy exchange, right? There's always an energy, and that goes both ways if we talk about boundaries or what have you, because in a lot of our indigenous ways, people that do medicine, that do healing, and even in life, there always has to be an energy exchange. So if you're, if you give something to someone as a healer or as an advice giver or as someone that is in the helping profession, in the belief, is in the universe and everything that lives, you're supposed to get something back. But from an individualistic sense, it's like, oh, I don't want to be selfish. It's not like you owe me. It's because that's how things remain in balance, right? That's how things remain in balance. There needs to be an energy exchange, right? So like true indigenous healers will never charge, but they'll be open to donation, or people that go to them will know they might not charge me a specific quote, but I'm going to bring them something because of that energy exchange. So it is good manners, but it's more than that. It is like, oh, the right thing to do, but it's more than that. From a very basic understanding of the world and nature and the universe, it's how you keep balance, right? And so this idea of interdependence is also kind of a showing us again some of the wisdom of a lot of indigenous ways, which is that's how you keep a family, that's how you keep a community, that's how you could keep a society intact, right? Is you have that balance of that energy exchange, that interdependence. And so even if our families look different, that doesn't necessarily mean that the core principles or the core values of that familismo or the interconnectedness has to go away, right? We still can see that as the foundation. Excuse me. So on everyday life, of course, we still see that some of the roles are still similar, right? Mothers are still revered for like the commitment, the sacrifices they make for their kids. And we can talk more about how sometimes that self-sacrifice is kind of a distorted way of looking at balance, right? But we still have that reverence and that respect for mothers and motherhood. But we're seeing, of course, more um, college-educated people in our communities, and so that is beginning to shift some of those self-expectations about motherhood, right? We've already been seeing that women are holding off longer to become mothers if that's what they want to be. We still see, the oldest expected to do more, especially taking care of the siblings. Still see that. That's still part of, kind of like what our families look like. And that expectation that siblings are really going to look out for each other no matter what, right? They can be completely different personalities, but that friendship, that relationship from siblings is expected to be just as equal as friendships that each sibling, the friendships that they develop over the years, right? And so that is opposite for many white children who are taught mainly to socialize with same age peers. Like, we see that individualistic way of development, right? It's not that socializing with same age peers is bad, but it's seen as more ideal from an individualistic perspective. Again, it's not stated, I think there's a lack of self-awareness with a lot in the field about being based on a lot of individualistic kind of white values, because the field doesn't say from a individualistic white cultural way, we value same age peers. That's the best. It just says this is better in general, right? So it's not that it's not good, it's just that there are other ways. And so that has been, I think, one of the most understated, understudied benefits of having many siblings across generations, is because you learn to grow up with siblings across generations, right? Older and younger. So you have to develop different ways of interacting. You have to develop different ways of holding your own, like speaking your voice. And it gives you that kind of multi-generational experience that if you only say, oh man, I got to socialize my kids with the same age group, which again is not bad, right? But it doesn't have the same diversity of developmental experiences as having those, as having kind of siblings across generations. And so I think that is something that we haven't really explored as much. And that is still something that's part of our contemporary experience. We also still have, as we've been mentioning, a lot of traditional, quote unquote, traditional ways, traditional values. And maybe next time I can pass this along to you all in a PDF if you're interested. But these are just some of the things that is, I think it's good to look at and reflect on, because of course you see on either end kind of the opposite experiences, polar opposite, right? And you could probably add your own that aren't included in here. But one of the things that's good for us and for those of you that work with families, work with youth, work with kids, and they kind of are stuck, they seem to be stuck between this traditional way of doing things with their parents and maybe their contemporary, their current way of how their own life is. It's always nice to come up with a list of what those polar opposite things are, and then take examples of all of those, and not, again, not say, well, are you here and are they there, like a check on and off, but it's always like, where do they fall on the continuum? Like most of the time in your experience, like what tends to be true? And that really, I think, offers a lot of good reflection and discussion and also solutions sometimes. Like, well, most of the time we're on this side, but some of the times it's been on this side. You know, what was different about those times? Why is it different? And what you find is that even if some people are still more on like the traditional side, that sometimes there's at least a little variation in between, and that's the part where you can have discussion, where you can think through things, where maybe like, oh, maybe I can approach my dad in this way or my mom in this way, um and so I think seeing those things on a continuum can really be helpful, especially a lot of the way our families are today, right? And a lot of the different experiences they're having. Another core piece is this idea of personalismo. That's a core piece in our families. It's one of those that's a traditional way of being, but it's also contemporary. It may look a little different, you know, the way it is in our contemporary Chicano families, but we still see this as a way of interacting with people that is more than just what they call transactional. Like, it's more than just small talk, and it's more than just, hi, how are you doing? Fine, good. Like, how are you? Fine, good. Back and forth. Or like, can I ask you a question? Sure, I'll give you an answer. It's kind of like you give and take. But personalismo is more than that. It's more about trying to get to know the person in front of you, or at least assuming that they are more than just what they can do for you in the moment, right? And that's a way of relationship building. And we have a lot of those foundations in a lot of families to have that type of relationship building, which is funny because and a lot of the times when we have relationship issues, we don't make the connection to some of the very foundational things that we've learned. There are a lot of important things that we learn in our families, and even if it's not within our own family, we can see it in sometimes other families, you know, in our communities. There are many things that we learn that we don't tend to apply to other struggles that we're having, because it seems like those other struggles are completely different. But if we can take some time and reflect, we can see how some of these things can just shift to be more applicable, like, and helpful to some of the issues that we're facing today in our own life with our own relationships. So those are some key pieces, and I want to just pause because, you know, we're in a place where we're about to wrap up and we're about to close. So I just wanted to check in with everybody and see where you're at. If you have any questions, if you have any comments. Catalina, yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I thought it was really interesting at the beginning, and then later on, talking about the extended family and the like sort of the non-blood related family that becomes like family. And I think about, you know, my Nina, I think my my madrina, and I call her Nina. And I think about, you know, my tias that would take care of me, and their children became like my cousins because all of my dad's family is in Mexico. And so even though my cousins are still my cousins and I love them and I see them when I visit, you know, I didn't have that here because my mom was an only child. And so like, you know, and so the kids I grew up with, they feel like family to me, you know, and because we were raised together and, you know, their moms would take turns taking care of us and it was very collective. We would play together, we would eat together, all of those things in the neighborhood. And so, you know, it wasn't, you know, weird that, you know, sometimes everybody would just end up at somebody else's house for
Yeah.
dinner, you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
and so, you know, and then for the cultural shift, I really looked to my madrina, to my godmother, because she was a strong, independent woman coming from a very traditional family and trying to make her way through education. She actually went into the army for a little bit, which her family was really upset about, but she knew it would pay for school.
Right.
And so, you know, I really looked to her because I became, you know, known as the culture disruptor in my family because I also wanted to go away for school.
Yeah.
And so her relationship with me became crucial for me understanding how to navigate those things. And even though, you know, we're both labeled as the culture disruptors in our families still depend on us because I'm the oldest of my siblings. And then she's the oldest girl in her family. So, you know, and now I'm an elder because all our parents are gone. And, you know, I saw all of that sort of play out. And she's an elder, you know, for us. And she also baptized my sister, and she's been crucial to us, you know, in grieving our parents and things. So,
Yeah.
I'm really thankful that my mom taught me those values, and I've seen the huge differences in how the white American community treats their family versus how, you know, my family expected. You know, you put a roof over someone's head if you can, like, you know, you feed each other if you can. And it's really bizarre to me that, you know, white Americans will let their families be homeless, will let them go, you know, hungry. And and you know, I've had to have it explained to me, like, why don't you have these safety nets? And so, you know, we also grew up in immigrant communities, so that was part of the need was always there. So it was always going to be reciprocal, and we always knew that we could then turn to each other again. And so I think that's the difference is, you know, the structures were there. We leaned on each other when we needed to, and we knew it was reciprocal. Whereas in other cultures, especially European American, that's not necessarily the case. So.
Thank you so much for sharing those experiences, Catalina. Thank you. Jose, I see you have your hand.
Yes. So this is kind of like a question. So with the whole culture shift that's going on with our youth and the new generation, a lot of them are becoming what I would say westernized. But I also, so it's a mixture. I'm a little confused and I'm stuck in the middle between what to accept because I don't want to I don't want to challenge them and say that you're doing it the wrong way because they're, you know, but I also do want to maintain our culture. But a lot of it is also like not just our youth, but you know, individuals, older adults, we're also becoming more aware of what we should deal with and what we should not deal with. So when it comes to for example, a family, you know, traditional culture is like, hey, all of us get together, but and usually it usually happens where, you know, some people are fighting. There's always
Yeah.
some drama. So now we just do not want to deal with that no more, and we find that we don't have to because that's our independence. That's what makes us feel safe, is not to deal with that kind. But so then we separate ourselves. So that's what our youth are, you know, it's happening right now is they're becoming more aware, which is great. I love it. Everyone should also they should our youth should have power over the actions that, you know, their own choices. But how do we circle back around keeping our tradition instead of automatically going what makes you feel, ultimately what makes you feel peaceful?
Yeah, no, that's where a lot of us are at. It's been a couple generations like that. And I think one of the things that we try to communicate is, and it looks different, and it's not a simple like turn on the light like switch and everything's different, but the heart of it is separating the behaviors. Like, yeah, sometimes you get in a fight and sometimes people are oppressive, like, so those are some behaviors that aren't really great, right? And we want to be able to separate ourselves from some of those behaviors that are not healthy. And I know we could talk about a lot of definitions of healthy, but just in general, right? Like, not healthy. um Separate that from the intention of the value, right, of like familismo, interconnectedness. Like, for our youth, it's probably a good value to teach, like, hey, I got you back, you got my back, right? Like, let's depend on each other. Let's, and even if they might be doing things different or separating, or us separating ourselves a little bit, um that's a behavior of separation, but we don't have to separate ourselves from still wanting to have that value of connectedness, right? So we just try to like see when our youth, even in their interactions with their friendships, with their decisions, like trying to keep an eye out for the times we see them manifesting those values and pointing that out, like, hey, I saw you do, that's really good, that's a good thing, or whatever. So that even if they're making different decisions on certain places, we're trying to keep an eye out for the the cultural values that we have in place that may show up in different ways. Um, so it's a tough process, but it's that process of not not seeing the values as necessarily negative, but seeing how we can still maintain them, but maybe not maintain them in the same spaces or with the same people, because sometimes that's not always the best thing, right? Um, so I don't know if that's helpful. I know it's kind of general and specific, but and I know it's like, again, it's not like, oh yeah, this is what we do, right? But that's what we try to move toward, kind of that general idea that in doing it in that way. So that's what I think about.
Can I piggyback on that?
Okay.
Because I'm actually in that boat of trying to hold on to a lot of like the culture, the Mexican traditions, and follow, like making sure that my household se quede mexicano, se quede mexicana. And but at the same time, you know, in some ways not fitting in with my family anymore. And because I am a first gen and professional, there's all these labels that I have in my family. And it's hard to fit in because like I'm a therapist and I'm the black sheep and I always have an opinion, and there's always something that that I have to say. And so I'm a little bit ousted in some ways from the family, and finding a balance. And so for me, what I found is that I'm trying to do my best to integrate to my family of origin, but at the same time, I'm creating a new family where I'm at within the same, that have the same ideals, similar ideals, and that share like similar values that I have. And it's a little, I feel a little bit torn because I'm sacrificing like a part of me, but at the same time I'm gaining something new. So it's interesting. I don't know if anybody is feeling that way, but that's a little bit of where I'm dealing with in my situation. So yeah, it was interesting that he said that, and then I was thinking about my situation.
Yes, no, thank you so much, Mayra. Yeah,
Mhm.
I think a lot. I've heard a lot of us in that some situation, and I know we got to wrap up. I'll say one thing about that too is that's the one thing I think from our families is, which makes sense. It's not a dig against our families in this way. It's like, but and it makes sense. they see who they are as also part of their culture, of who they are, their cultural identity, because that's their life and that's how they know it, and that's fine. So then when someone moves away from specific behaviors that they've seen, then they make that assessment, or they're like, oh, you're basically moving away from being Mexicano or Mexican, and because they only have seen this one path of being that way, right? And that makes sense, you know. But from the other side, you know, we can see that being who we are doesn't always necessarily depend on um, being in the same connection with our families in the same way, because we've taken those values and we've done something a little different with them. But just because we act different than our family doesn't necessarily mean that we've left those values. We're just now in a different room, right? We've taken a different path. And so it's a both and. Like, it makes complete sense that they see someone, our family see someone deviate, that they see it deviating from the familia and from the culture, because that's all they've known. But we're on the other side and we can look back and see. It doesn't make it easier sometimes. It doesn't make it easier with those, but at least we can know, like, we can see, no, we are taking that with us. We're taking it here. And it doesn't mean we're completely, you know, we still come back. It's just a different path. Um, so I think I'm gonna begin to close with that tonight, because I know that it is late for some of us and we do have stuff to get to, but I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank you for participating in any and every way you did, and I look forward to having more discussions. This was just the beginning. There's a lot more to come. So I look forward to seeing you all again next week. And again, if you can't, like Maida, if you can't, we'll send you the recording. Gracias, everybody. Tlasokamati, Mateo.
Thank you.
That's
Appreciate it. See you guys soon.
you.